Okay, so good afternoon, Warsaw. Thanks so much for coming. So today we're going to talk about an app a day. Can pharma-tech cure all of our ills? So I remember as a kid growing up, the phrase "an apple a day keeps the doctor away." I'm not sure how old I was when somebody pointed out that there was very very poor clinical data to support that fact. So I'm wondering, is the data around digital healthcare technology any better? So today I'm going to talk about the potential of pharma-tech and also the challenges facing it. So a little bit about me. I'm Frank. I'm from Ireland. It's the little teddy bear-shaped island on the edge of Europe. Originally, I've worked in product design, and then about 20 years ago, I moved into the world of UX. I know what you're thinking, right? I couldn't be that old, right? Okay, but I am. Now I'm director of frontend.com, which is a UX design consultancy formed in 1998. And from our base in Ireland, we've worked with clients all over the world in many different industries. We've worked in software, web, product, finance. With reference to the last talk, we've even actually tried to make paying taxes a little bit more enjoyable, although I don't think we succeeded there. More recently, we've been working a lot in the health industry. So the health industry is unique. It's kind of unique because it's the only one where the customer always comes last. For years, the industry has ignored the experience of patients because patients don't have a choice. You have to take your medicine, so you take your medicine. As a result, the general level of design in the medical devices was and still is very poor. Let me show you what I mean. So this is an example from 2010. This is a client of ours, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But they're the world number one in their field. It's a diabetes blood glucose meter. That their sales are 3 billion annually. Swiss-German engineering, excellent quality. So this is what it looked like on the shelf of Walmart. And this is what it looks like 20 seconds after you open it. No control over the discovery sequences. 12 pieces of documentation, all tightly folded. No clear starting point. Device assembly is needed. Lots of complexity. I've seen cars with smaller user manuals than this product. So obviously this affects the patient, but less obvious is the effect it has on nurses in terms of training and support. And that's critical. If you don't get the HCP on your side, your product bombs. So even though these guys are world number one, and this is an excellent quality product, it posed a huge amount of problems from the health administration point of view. So what's the big deal? What difference does that make? Well, this is what happens. People stop adhering to their treatment, and they stop at an alarming rate. So when the first time I saw this graph, I was like, wow, this is sort of huge. I mean, think about this. So this graph is showing you the medication drop-off rates in the months after somebody gets discharged from hospital with a chronic disease. So you've got a chronic illness, and you're generally given a course of treatment to adhere to, and that's the treatment that's going to manage your illness moving forward, often over a 20-year, 30-year period. The graph here shows the adherence drop-off broken down by different diseases. These are not trivial diseases. We've got breast cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, gastrointestinal, neuroscience, antipsychotic, and respiratory diseases. And what amazes me is how similar it all is, that the drop-off is so stark in that first 4-month period that by month 6, less than 50% of people are taking their medication. There's a huge problem there, and I can't help thinking that some of this problem may in fact be a UX problem. And there are lots of reasons why people stop taking their medication. Sometimes people just forget. So it's called non-intentional non-adherence. So forgetting your medication can be a side effect of your illness. It can cause forgetfulness. It can be just plain down to forgetfulness. But there are also intentional non-adherence issues, which means that basically people are deciding rationally not to take their treatment. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's a complex issue. I guess from what UX has taught us is that we don't always do what we should do. Users do what they want to do. And ultimately, we need to take that into consideration. So looking at the figures, these figures relate to the US. So more than half the population at any one time is taking a prescription drug. Millions of prescriptions never get collected from the pharmacy, and 50% of us don't take our medications as prescribed, resulting in about 125,000 deaths each year in the United States from non-adherence. So that's not an insignificant number of people, and it's a big problem. So patients don't get better because of non-adherence. Doctors don't know why they're not responding to treatment, and then the payers are burdened with the high cost of treatments. And they're paying for treatments that aren't being followed and treatments that don't work. So it's not efficient for everybody. Drugs are becoming more and more expensive, and some of the new drugs are costing several $100,000 per patient per year to give, to make available through the health service. Insurance companies and governments alike are looking at these drugs and wondering, what's the efficacy of giving this treatment? Is it going to work if we give this treatment? And so pharmaceutical companies have this non-adherence problem that they have to deal with, where they can't demonstrate that people are taking the drugs. And so this is part of the motivation behind the new wave of pharma-tech. So non-adherence is also a costly matter, and it adds roughly $100 billion to the cost of the US health service each year. That's in additional tests, additional time in the hospital, new labs, more healthcare provider time, more visits to the ER, and we've established that adherence is the #1 problem for healthcare providers. So what about the solutions? Well, pharma is turning to technology to help. I'm sure many of you heard Siri's talk yesterday about the power of IBM Watson. That's just one of a multitude of technologies that's coming, that are literally queuing up at the door of healthcare, trying to get in. We've got connected devices, smartphone apps, intelligent pills, digiceuticals, e-therapies. And so all of these technologies are potentially available to us to help manage this healthcare issue. In future, digital health services are going to become part of every new medicine. Note, not most new medicines, but every new medicines. This is the opinion of Andy Jones, who's head of intelligent pharma at AstraZeneca. And where is this leading to? Well, the pharma industry is going to become a service industry. It's going to be less about delivering products and more about delivering services, providing drugs, support, monitoring big data, selling treatment engagement time as opposed to drugs. In the same way that Rolls-Royce sells aircraft engines based on uptime, so they charge airlines based on the amount of time the plane stays in the air, pharma companies can now, in the future, start charging the health service for patient engagement time or treatment time, the amount of time a patient stays on a drug. So when we talk about pharma-tech, what are we actually talking about? Well, this is just one or two examples that I've picked to kind of give you an illustration of the kind of technology that's being developed. By no means pick these because they're the best and the brightest, but they do kind of illustrate the point pretty well. So the first one is an asthma drug adherence app. It's connected to a smart inhaler. So the basic functionality of these kind of apps is to remind patients when to take their dose and then record the fact that the dose is taken. That's the basic premise. And sync to the smart inhaler, you can't cheat the system, so it knows when you've taken the dose, it knows how much you've dosed, it even knows how effective that dose was, and it can transmit that to your doctor. All good so far. With smartphone technology, we can overlay onboard data on top of this, so we can kind of start overlaying weather information. You can monitor user activity, so how many steps have you taken, and provide this with real-time user feedback and alerts back to the patient. Onboard accelerometer on the actual smart inhaler can let the app know if you're using the inhaler correctly. So with some of these drugs, you actually have to hold the inhaler at exactly the right angle before you administer the dose, otherwise you're not getting the full effectiveness of that dose. And based on your behavior or your skill at using it, it can deliver training videos to improve how your technique at taking your meds. Finally, these kind of apps are a communication conduit. Now, it's kind of a difficult problem to solve. Nobody wants to make open access to the healthcare team available through apps because clearly they'd be snowed under. But there are lots of ways around it. This particular example uses scripted interactions to gather patient-reported outcomes. So a scripted interaction is a predefined set of questions and answers. So you give people a series of multi-choice questions to answer, but it's delivered in the form of a chat. So it's using kind of chatbot kind of design to drive engagement and to make it feel like it's more personal. The point of this is to deliver behavior change information or nudges back to the patient. So this is key. One of the key issues to tackle non-adherence is to actually change patient behavior. So you need to understand what's causing the non-adherence before you can actually address that behavior. So based on these question and answer little modules, we can automatically understand what is causing elements of patient behavior and then try to address that through small nuggets of information. So there's quite sophisticated AI working behind this. When you visit your doctor, then they can see exactly how you've been doing over the last 6 months, not just your adherence and activity, but your patient-reported outcomes, etc. And so it makes the decision-making for them a lot easier. So the second example is a connected device. So this is a blood glucose meter from, it's called Dr. Tang, and it's from China. And actually, this blood glucose meter released last year, it sets a new global benchmark for connected diabetes care. This is pretty incredible. It looks like an iPhone, and in many respects actually behaves a little bit like one as well. First of all, it's got an out-of-box experience to die for. This is like as good as anything Apple have ever produced out of Cupertino. If you compare this to the discovery sequence I showed you earlier on with the world #1 product, this is definitely a high-quality challenger. So everything is kind of controlled in terms of the sequence of discovery. It's numbered, it's clear, it has onboard instructions to kind of help users understand. But one of the most interesting things about this device is the way it uses motivation and gamification. So it delivers things like healthcare nudges. It delivers your stats based on what your blood glucose readings have been over the last while, but it also gamifies your blood glucose testing. So anyone who's familiar with diabetes will know that you've got to test your blood sugars at least twice a day, sometimes 8 times a day. It's a pretty onerous task, and it's something that a lot of diabetics like to kind of put on the long finger and ignore. But with this app, when it reminds you to take your blood glucose reading, you've got skin in the game, because essentially it gives you money. It actually gives you real money if you've got your reading within the range. If you're outside the range, you lose money, and the money goes towards your insurance bill. So it's incorporated with your insurance provider. So every time you test your blood glucose and it's within the acceptable range, it makes your insurance premium that little bit cheaper. Every time you're outside the range, a little bit more expensive. They can do this because Tencent, who produce the meter, have made an agreement with the largest health insurance, the state insurance provider in China. So they're able to do that. The other interesting thing about this is it gives you direct access to a healthcare professional. So there's a little, if you look at number 4 there, if you tap that button, that basically will call a nurse, and you can talk to a diabetes nurse specialist on the line using WeChat, which is part of their app infrastructure. And again, that's quite radical, to be able to actually use the device you're using to manage your illness, actually talk to a healthcare professional at the same time. That's pretty impressive. Tencent invested $80 million in a call center manned with healthcare professionals to run this service and continue to do that. So they've really committed themselves to providing this service, and it's a pretty good one. So there's lots of ways that pharma-tech can help patients, through education and training, treatment reminders, delivering real-time patient data, patient monitoring, reported outcomes, behavioral change, and care team communication. But is any of this really solving the problem? That adherence drop-off problem that we talked about. Well, it depends kind of how you define the problem, really. It might seem obvious, but pharma-tech is mainly focused on solving pharma's problems, not really focused on solving much else. You have to look at healthcare as an ecosystem. So there's 5 different players in the healthcare system, and each of them need to have their needs met. It's a finely balanced system. If the balance breaks down, the system fails. Right now, pharma is really looking after the needs of the payer and the patient. So it says to the payer, I'm going to gather all this wonderful data, so you're going to know how the treatment is working and how effective it is. And it says to the patient, your doctor's going to know how you're doing 24/7. Isn't that cool? So you're never going to feel neglected. But it's not saying an awful lot to the healthcare professional, except other than maybe you guys are going to have to work an awful lot harder for the same amount of pay. And that's the key problem. So as part of our work, we do a lot of research with healthcare professionals all over the world, primarily researching how they use these types of solutions. And what are we hearing? Well, overall, there's a willingness among healthcare professionals to use digital solutions, but there must be clinical evidence. Unfortunately, there's no clinical evidence. Well, very little anyway, to support long-term adherence and outcome benefits. And that's a key problem, because when doctors consider the upheaval and the extra effort involved in taking on board one of these solutions, they need to justify that with clinical evidence that it's going to improve the outcome. But that's not to say it doesn't work. It's just that the evidence isn't there, because by and large, the companies who are producing these apps and these connected devices haven't actually gathered the clinical evidence. The first question I get asked in every hospital clinic when I go in there is, does this system integrate with my EHR? Unfortunately, the answer is most often no, and that adds significantly to the HCP workload. So you can imagine setting up a patient, like entering their date of birth, their details, all of the patient record. That's typing time. If it's integrated with your EHR, you just suck that data straight into the database. Also, you've got to consider how it's going to be used in practice. If it's not integrated, it means the doctor is using two apps in front of the patient instead of one. He's taking a note in the EHR, and he's also going to have to take some notes in the app that runs this system. So again, that's not a good situation for either. The last thing I need is more data to monitor. So the promise of more patient data is not as compelling as you might think. Doctors are overloaded with data a lot of the time, and they don't really have much more time to monitor. It also adds to their responsibility. If they're given the data and they don't monitor it, then they are sharing the risk if something does actually go wrong. So if you've been put on a new experimental drug and you're being monitored, but the doctor misses the vital early warning signs, he's responsible if something untoward happens. So they don't necessarily relish the additional responsibility unless they can bill for the time that's going to go into monitoring this. And at the moment, there's no way to bill this. From the nurse perspective, it doesn't really get a lot better. This is a quote from a diabetes nurse specialist in New York. I get 30 minutes to see my patients. I've got to check the vitals, do a physical exam, request labs, deal with any issues, and now I need to find time to train this device. I just don't have that luxury. And that really kind of sums up the experience of nurses. Nurses are the heroes of the healthcare system. You get 15 minutes with your neurologist, but the nurse will spend as much time as you want with her. But it's very, very difficult for nurses to train devices. It's difficult for them to troubleshoot these devices. Sometimes they don't understand the devices very well themselves. And all of this detracts from their nursing time. The other problem is that doctors never do any of the admin work. Even though they're supposed to, it often falls to nurses to maintain the data. So imagine the reality of this situation, where patients are on more than one drug. You've got more than one app potentially to manage. But patients change drugs regularly. Treatments change all the time. You're not responding to drug A, we're going to move you to drug B. So now I've got to take all of the data off of the first app. I've got to put all the data back into another app. And set the patient back up again, maybe retrain them how to use it, because it probably works differently because it comes from a different company. And it doesn't really deal with comorbidity either, because in many cases, patients have more than one condition at the same time, and so all of this needs to be managed. Rheumatology is a good example. I mean, in the interviews I've done, rheumatologists would have upwards of 30 primary medications at their disposal that they would be using all of the time. All of these are made by different manufacturers. All of them would have different apps associated with them. It just becomes a logistical nightmare. It's clearly unworkable for a healthcare professional to have to deal with this. So instead of solving the problem, pharma-tech has the potential to make it significantly worse for the healthcare providers. And without buy-in for the healthcare providers, the system is just not going to work. The view from the patient is a lot better. You'll be glad to know. It's a bit more positive. They like the fact that they're being monitored 24/7. This is one of the things we were unsure of when we started doing research around this. How would you feel if you were carrying around a device that's monitoring your every move? It's counting your steps. It's asking you to report your mood every day. It's looking at the drugs you're taking. So we found that, by and large, a lot of patients are very happy with that. They also feel that these types of systems help them communicate better with the care teams. So it gives them the opportunity to reflect on how they've been doing over the last few months when they meet their doctor to talk to them. It gives them the potential to actually contact their doctor through the device in some cases, which is obviously very good. There are concerns about data security, primarily more in Europe than in the US. We found that patients in the US are quite accepting of and trusting in where the data goes. In Europe, it's much more skeptical. And in fact, in one project we worked on, the launch country was actually changed because the attitudes toward data security were so stringent among patients that it was just never going to work. It's a bit more weak when it comes to looking at the long-term usage. So I think those reminders might become annoying pretty quickly, and I might have to switch them off, said every patient ever. Okay, it's like nobody wants your iPhone like alerting you like 3 times a day to take your medication, or 6 times a day, depending. Other patients would say that they use it for a bit, but they'd stop if they didn't feel like it was adding any value. So it's really important with these solutions that they add benefit or they add value very early in the process, which is kind of challenging because on day one you've got no data in the system, so you've just set it up and you're working at it, and it tells you nothing for about 30 days most of the time, so you've got to wait until a period of time has passed before you get any kind of meaningful readout from it. A word on app usage. So there's a lot been made of the explosion of healthcare apps today. There's 165,000 mobile health apps in the App Store, and the vast majority of these are focused on wellness and fitness area. About 12% focus on specific disease types and treatments. But just 36 apps account for half of all downloads in the health sector. So think about that. There's an awful lot of apps out there that nobody's using. Download usage rates are really, really low. I can actually tell you of one example where we worked with a pharma client to develop version 2.0 of a patient adherence app. And during the process, they were referring to a particular strategy that was used in a previous version, and that some of the management team were quite keen on kind of furthering this process. So we had a look at the previous app, and then we asked them for some of the download stats just to get a feeling. And I got an Excel spreadsheet that said, France 12, the UK 2, Netherlands 2, for example, and at the bottom it said 16. And I said, well, can you just tell me what the units are here? And I said, the units are people. 16 people downloaded the app in the previous year. This app cost at least $200,000 to produce. Would have been cheaper, write everybody a check and have them go and advocate your medicine among all of their friends, or stand outside the hospital and canvass people. So when 16 people are using your app, you really have to stand back and think, why are we doing this? And what are we doing? What are we doing wrong? So long-term adherence to these apps can become a problem in itself. So you replace the problem of medication adherence with a problem of app adherence. And then that kind of multiplies the effect. So I think to counteract that, we need to think about solutions that don't need to be used all the time. Good solutions tend to kind of where possible, still work even when the patient doesn't use them. So if you've got an auto-injector and you're injecting and it's sending the data on its own, well then at least the patient doesn't have to do anything except take their medicine. If they've got to complete some tasks on the phone and they're not using their app, or they've changed their phone, or they've lost it, well then you're not getting any of that data. So they should be designed to cater for partial or passive use. Another thing we've noticed in terms of using apps is that it generally tends to work better if you're given an app to work for a discrete amount of time. So if the doctor tells you you're going to use this app for 6 months, and at the end of 6 months we'll be done, and during that 6-month period you try to kind of instill the right kind of behavior and attitude towards your treatment that kind of counteracts that really steep drop-off in the adherence line, well then that's a better idea than giving somebody an app that you're going to hope they'll use indefinitely. So to wrap up, I guess, pharma-tech, it has a huge potential, but to achieve this, we need to consider all of the users in the healthcare system. It can't just deal with the needs of payers and the needs of the patients. We need to also consider the HCPs that are going to run the system. But the technology is there and the potential is there, and the potential is huge. We also need a systemic design approach. We need something that tackles the system, not just the use and behavior of patients within the system. Specifically, it needs to be integratable with the EHR and other systems. It needs to be drug agnostic. So by drug agnostic, it should tackle treatment areas, not drugs. So that if you're a neurologist and you're dealing with multiple sclerosis, you should be looking at a solution that caters for all drugs within that field. So you can move patients around easily and you don't lose their data, and you can still compare how their outcomes are going. It should create less work, not more, for HCPs. So there's an onus on the pharma industry to provide monitoring and support of this data, because clearly the healthcare providers don't have time to do that. And in fact, there are solutions in place where third-party call centers monitor patient apps, and they do a kind of a triaging service where they will monitor how the patient's doing, and if an alert is raised, they will ring the patient, see how the patient's doing, and if it's a serious problem, they will then escalate that back to the healthcare team. So it's not putting extra pressure on the healthcare team. In fact, it's removing pressure from them because they're going to get less white noise in the system. It needs to be economically viable. It's really important that doctors can bill for the time they use. I mean, it can be surprising for somebody who's never spent time in a hospital talking to these guys, but they're very cut and dried about what they will do and what they can bill for. I mean, remote consultation is a big technology that's been starting to come to the fore now. But most of the US insurance companies don't allow you to claim for a remote consultation. So if you do a remote call or a video call with a patient, which would be cheaper and more time effective for everybody, you can't bill for that. So doctors will still make patients to come in. They don't want to deal with them over Skype or deal with them over any kind of video chat, even if they can sort out the security issues that would entail. So, billable acts need to be in line with the solutions that are designed. And these, finally, actually, clinical evidence. It's really important that we have clinical evidence, and there's a cost involved for this. So if you develop an app and you want to put it into a clinical trial, you're talking about, at least another year, if not 2 years of testing time before you're going to gather that data. That's not something that most kind of app development houses or pharmaceutical companies would undertake lightly. So these aren't really small challenges. And so I think but it gives you, I guess, a clearer picture that the healthcare revolution that we hear so much about is not going to happen today or tomorrow. It's going to take a lot longer to kind of address these and to tackle integration. Integration is going to be a huge one because the EHR market is very protective, and it resists opening itself up to any newcomers or small startups who want to kind of piggyback on their valued position within the hospital. So the last thing I'm going to show you, just on the theme of positive tech, is a piece of work we did in the studio in Dublin in relation to migrant access to healthcare. So each year we do a social needs project, which is a pro bono project that we work on for free, and we usually kind of gather students from various colleges to come and work with us for a period of time, and we just kind of blue sky some ideas and try to solve some problems. So last year we worked in the area of migrant healthcare. We had all been following the Syrian migrant crisis on the news, and it's very distressing pictures that we saw. And we were wondering as designers, what can we do to help? You know, you kind of feel like compelled. There must be something we can do to make it even just a little bit better. So with that in mind, we contacted the UN Migration Group in Geneva. And through a series of conversations, we actually set this project up with their help. And I'm going to play you a little video which explains the rest.
Civil war, poverty and terrorism are tearing communities apart worldwide.
65 million people are now displaced globally. This is the highest since World War II.
Last year, the International Organization for Migration actually attended the needs of 5.2 million people.
Even though access to healthcare is a basic human right, because the growing numbers of migrants and refugees, it's becoming increasingly difficult to provide that healthcare on the ground.
Realising the pressure that IOM were under, Frontend volunteered to conceptualise a future vision for migrant healthcare.
Earlier this year, we approached the top design colleges, and what we wanted to do was to conceptualise ideas and come up with solutions for the challenges that the IOM were facing.
We had a phenomenal response. So we had applicants from all over the world who wanted to come to Frontend and get engaged with this, social needs project.
Research is huge. It's very, very important for informing design. Without it, you're designing in a vacuum.
These people, they don't have information, they don't have knowledge of language, they don't know what they have to do.
Well, it was a great experience to actually meet and hear his story. It really puts things in perspective for when you're creating this kind of stuff.
The students explored a whole range of ideas, and what we did is we took the team here at Frontend and we worked with the IOM to develop those ideas and to see what was practical.
We're seeing people coming from different countries, which means we have different languages, literacy rates, and hugely different cultures. One obvious area that was in need of improvement was medication labelling.
Well, typically what happens is there's handwritten labels and they're stuck on Ziploc bags. Obviously this is inconsistent, it can cause confusion, so there was a limited amount of information on the labels in the first place. So what we did was we worked with the IOM and we identified a potential solution for creating a standardised labelling system that aid workers can put onto the Ziploc bags themselves. One of the things that we introduced was a numbering and colour coding system so that both aid workers and migrants could actually identify the medicines very, very quickly. We looked at important information on medication and we convey that graphically and make sure that more people understood the key messages that were on those labels. Obviously, the medicines didn't go out with leaflets or anything like that, and we knew that a lot of migrants actually had smartphones. So we put information at the bottom that could be easily scanned, and that would integrate with an app that would give the migrant or the patient extended information.
Anything that has a standardisation that can cross organisations and also cross languages and cultures is useful, and I think it's easy to follow. Particularly, I think people with literacy problems, but also older people with eyesight problems. It was also making the health worker safer as well in what they're giving somebody. The person knowing what they're to take, also that the advice they got was correct in the first place.
Standardized labeling ensures that we reduce mistakes. There's less anxiety and uncertainty on the part of the migrants and refugees, and that we operate on the same level across the board, whether it's IOM, WHO, or any other agency working with migrants and refugees. We really can't wait to actually get it out there in the field and ensure that people finally have access to healthcare without any of the challenges that they're facing now.
Good design and human-centred design can make a huge impact.
So that project was completed up to concept stage and presented to the guys in the UN migration group last year, and we're currently now looking at ways of funding it to move it forward with the UN to get an actual pilot built and installed in one of their camps. So it shows how small ideas can happen and can be really effective. And that, technical solutions don't have to be overly complicated. It's simply just a web-driven database with multiple languages and a little bit of kind of smartphone technology involved to kind of put the whole thing together, but it makes a huge difference. And it doesn't necessarily impact on the way the healthcare workers perform their job on the ground. It actually makes less work for them rather than more. So that is it. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Do we have questions?
I have a question about the one slide where you had listed out like the opportunities.
Could you just turn up the volume a little bit? Sorry, I'm partially deaf, so I don't hear so well. Sorry.
Though you had one slide where you listed out the opportunities for pharma-tech, and one was about, I forget how you put it, but like not an app for one drug, but for like a treatment.
Drug agnostic.
Yeah, exactly. How would you see that working as like, because right now, right, pharma sort of supports building that one app. If it was drug agnostic, how would you see that sort of working?
Well, it can work. It can be developed. In fact, I'll be careful how I say things here. I know that such solutions are being developed, both by pharmaceutical companies and by non-pharma companies. So it's really kind of going to be a race to the post to see who gets there first, whether it's going to be one of the big tech companies like Apple or Google, or whether it's going to be one of the big pharma companies. But pharma companies are not afraid to actually kind of give up their ownership of their own particular drug to try and kind of create a platform that can support many.
So what do you think as, because we all know that all the big companies and big pharma, as they are big, have problems with innovating. So, but I think in big pharma there is even bigger problem. So, what do you think is that particular problem that preserves them from implementing these supportive apps or services? What do you think might or should happen to change it?
So if I understand your question, what's preventing big pharma from implementing these?
What's the problem in there that they are not moving faster?
So the big pharma doesn't need any more encouragement. Like there's any amount of these apps being developed, and it's all happening at pace. I think I saw a figure that pharma companies are investing 20% of their revenue in digital services and technology development. So that's a huge amount for companies that normally develop drugs. And there are big challenges for the way that they work, because typically to develop a new drug can take 20 years of research locked away in a room, developing a successful healthcare application.
And they're always going to find a customer for that, yeah?
So the problem is really the healthcare system that the solutions are being delivered into. It's very uneven. It varies hugely from place to place, not even from country to country, but from city to city. And in the US, it can hugely depend on the insurance companies who are running these hospitals. And that's the challenge. So there are no easy answers right now until we get, let's say, an open playing field in terms of interoperability between systems, which is catered for in the US legislation, but the legislation is worded in a way that makes it quite easy to dodge that issue. So the vested interests who have healthcare systems at play in these hospitals can say their systems are capable of interoperability, but they don't have to necessarily make it very easy. So that's the difficulty, I think, is actually creating something that works on the ground. And so pharmaceutical companies have difficulty in doing research in clinics because of the relationship between pharma and healthcare has to be kind of tightly governed. So that can be a problem. And I think the problem itself then needs a lot of user research and a lot of kind of careful contextual analysis to kind of define the problem properly so that the solutions that are being designed aren't compounding it but are actually helping to solve it. But it's a difficult problem. It's not insurmountable.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was just wondering about the solution that you're proposing. So there are a lot of visual element and pictogram, and I've been working in project where that was a very big challenge because, of course, you have different culture, and how do they interpret that? So I was just wondering if you took that into consideration, and if yes, how?
Yeah. I mean, it is challenging, and we need to do a lot more testing on that. The situation here really is looking at what the aid agencies are using at the moment. It's a case of the best being the enemy of the good. We can easily make a solution that's an awful lot better than what's currently there while not being absolutely perfect. So the key idea is to make sure that medication instructions are legible. Yeah. So each of the labels has, once you select your language pairs, and you can have up to 4 languages on the label, it clearly marks what the medication is and the instructions are given in text. The pictograms are there really to help people who have very low literacy levels to kind of help memorize or to help them understand or intuit, what they're supposed to do with a drug, like taking it with water or take before a meal, that kind of thing. And the idea of the smartphone app was really partly to get over some of that issues. So by kind of scanning the label, you can get a video or audio information in your language to describe how to take the medication and what the medication does. One of the things that was really interesting was that nearly every migrant has a smartphone. And we were just like, really? Like they have smartphones? So it's the last thing they give up. And a lot of the solutions that the UN are actually working on are based on smartphone technology. They just released a sort of an app. I can't remember the name, but it's a way for people to transfer money. Like it's a wiring kind of app, so you can transfer money to the mobile phone of somebody from the country they have left if they need money in an emergency over a smartphone. So it's quite kind of it's an interesting world we live in, where refugees all have smartphone technology. All good?
Oh, come on.
I was wondering the app adherence adoption /adoption. What are the challenges? You've done a lot of research in this area. What are the barriers there that prevent or continue adherence or adoption in a longer term? And then what are, beside the Tencel Dr. Chinese product, what are some other great examples that kind of tackled that challenge?
What are the key problems for app adherence?
Yes.
Okay, it's actually easy to hear you without the microphone. So I think there's no way getting around the fact that like everybody in this room probably has 100 apps on their iPhone, and some of those apps you've only used once or twice. That's just human nature, and people will behave like that. So I think you can employ a lot of strategies to overcome that problem, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that there will be people who won't use the app or who will drop off using it quite quickly. I mean, if you've got cancer and you've got life-saving cancer drugs to take and you stop taking them, it's a no-brainer that people will stop using an app way before they get to that threshold. So in my thinking, the solution is that not using the app cannot cause the system to fail. It has to work without user intervention if possible. So developing passive ways of gathering information and storing information at the patient's consent, but that doesn't require them to interact with it, is one good step. And also, I think limiting the amount of time that you expect the patient to have to use the app for is a good way of driving people to use it. So if you tell them, look, you only have to use it for the first 2 months, after that you can stop, you will find that a lot of people will continue using it, but at least they have a goal or a target. Once patients get set up using a system, you can find that the data and the insights you provide them with can become the thing that keeps them coming back for more, but you have to get over that initial hurdle. So we find that like some of the apps can provide incredibly detailed contextual information. Like if the app knows, you know, you haven't been taking your medication and your activity has dropped by 20% and your last patient-reported outcome of your mood score was following a certain pattern, and it's able to tell you, you need to contact your HCP because this is happening, X, Y, and Z. And when you do, or even better, the HCP contacts you before you even do anything because they're intervening based on the monitoring service that is going on. That's a huge value. And what we have found in the field is that it's that first intervention. So there are apps like this already out there, obviously. And what we've found from talking to nurses and patients is that it's the time when they get the first intervention. So they got the app and they go, yeah, I got this app, you know, it's adherence, blah, blah, blah. Do not really ignore it. And then 3 months later, they get a phone call from a call center saying, is everything okay? We noticed that over the last 3 days, you haven't been behaving like you normally behave. And they're like, whoa, how do you know that? Well, we're monitoring you on the app, and you know, and then suddenly, like, they go, wow, this is amazing. I'm now being cared for 24/7, and that's a sea change. So I think if you get to that point, that's a huge incentive for people to keep using it. So when we design these services, we try to kind of bring that point forward in the process. So like the day after you install the app and enroll and set yourself up, you get a phone call from somebody to welcome you to the service and to say, hey, I'm Marie, I'm going to be looking after you. And that can be a little bit to kind of pull them in and keep them coming back. You know, and then you know, trying to design like little kind of like timely interventions that will keep people kind of engaged. But it's not straightforward, and there is no kind of tried and tested kind of approach that works yet.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.